I'm a building services engineer at Historic England. Welcome to the second of our knowledge share webinars hosted by the Retrofit and Heritage Committee. And we're a relatively new committee, and what we've set out to do is disseminate knowledge, research and best practice on retrofit in historic buildings. The first webinar we had focused on evaluation and optimization, and we felt that was a good place to start because often when you're dealing with a historic existing building, you want to know exactly what you're up for and what's going on. That was recorded and it is available on CIBSE's website. So if you do want to go back to review that, or if you're visiting it for the first time, that's available online. Just so you're aware, this webinar is also going to be recorded and it'll be on CIBSE's website. So what does this one look at? Well, we're going to be focusing on strategy, brief and feasibility. And we have three excellent speakers that each have 10 minutes to share their ideas, followed by some Q&A for you to all get involved in. And just so you're aware, this is the first time we're actually using Teams, so apologies if there's some technical issues that we come across, but please do feel free to make use of the chat box to enter your questions in. So we have three speakers and we hope that each of them is going to provide a different perspective on the problem. The first is Andy Piper. Andy's the design director for the Palace of Westminster's Restoration and Renewal programme. And he's actually going to be telling us about how the brief and the strategy were developed, or as he said, are continued to be developed for the Houses of Parliament, and how that refurbishment project is developing. So without further ado, Andy, if I could pass over to you for you to share your slides so that we can get things underway.
Perfect. And just get a thumbs up that that's shared. Yep, lovely. So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and share with so many colleagues who hopefully are going to take something from all of our presentations today. As Amal said, we've got 10 minutes, so I won't tell you too much about the Palace of Westminster as an introduction, because luckily it's one of the most recognisable buildings in the world, and I suspect almost everyone on this call will be aware of it, what it does and what happens there. Obviously under the spotlight for the current, or the laying in state, which happened a few weeks ago now. But it is one of the most recognisable buildings in the world. And the programme itself, just really to talk you through what's really moving us forward for the Restoration Renewal programme, it's effectively the building services have deteriorated beyond the point that they can be repaired, and there's a driving need now to repair it, really to protect it from fire and make it fit for purpose for future generations. As well as the building services, the fabric of the building itself needs a lot of backlog maintenance to be undertaken, from conservation, from roofs, flat roofs, guttering, rainwater, external facade, internal conservation. So a huge amount of work to be undertaken, and we're still in the brief development stage for the palace. So I thought it would be worth just talking about some of the things that really struck with me. So I've been working on the programme now for 8 years, and when you're working with historic building stock, now I'm an engineer, but actually a lot of what I do is around the architecture of the building and really understanding the building itself. And one thing that really struck a chord with me when we thought about when the original building was built 150 years ago was what was happening at the time. So the building itself is there to pass legislation, it's there to represent the electorate. But the electorate that it was representing at the time that it's been conceived by Charles Barry, there was only 500,000 voters. So white men, wealthy men with their own land were the only people able to vote, and then everyone else you can see in the others there. So sort of just over 16 million, sorry, is the general population for the UK at the time, but only a very, very small fraction of those could vote. Where are we today? Well, we now have 47 million voters, so a completely different tone for now, what the building needs to do going forward. So the building really was built almost as a gentleman's club. So Charles Barry has done a very nice selection of gentlemen's clubs around the UK, which you can go and see. And that really comes through in the architecture of the building. And that very small proportion of voters did actually turn out to have a huge impact on what the building itself looked like. But we're not at 500,000 voters any longer. We're at 47 million. and a population of just over 60 million in total. So the building needs to move forward as best it can to meet those needs. Ultimately, it's a public building. It's serving the public, and it will continue to serve the public as we go forward. So then, starting to think about the future brief. So probably unusual to other programs, we have law. So we have an Act of Parliament that sets out what we were to do or are to do. And Section 5 of that law sets out the things that we have to have regard to. It's not a exhaustive list. You can appreciate that as a brief for a building. We need to flesh this out to some considerable margin. But it does give the key things which are important to members of both houses for us to consider, whether it's around public access, making the building really fit for its procedural purposes that it needs to deliver, and thinking about all the different users that might use the building. So we took that brief and then started to contextualize ourselves. So what are we dealing with? And there's three key points here, really. One great thing that our heritage buildings have is that we know that they're going to be here, and they're going to be here for a very long time. So, you know, if you were putting an office block up in the 1980s, you know, the life expectancy of that building could be something like 50 years. The building stock that we're dealing with is going to be here potentially in perpetuity. And that gives great opportunity, gives a great case to invest properly, but also you need to think about the societal change that could happen in the lifetime of these buildings. And we're, you know, back to that, you know, 500,000 voters that was prevalent at the time when Charles Barry designed his building. We really need to think about societal change. And obviously, COVID has impacted us all in many ways. We did a lot of scenario planning for what the future might look like for the Palace of Westminster, and it all revolved around more people coming to work, more people using the building. And then not one of our scenario plans was based around almost everyone working from home for the best part of 2 years. So really hard to judge what societal change will bring as we move forward. And then start to think about technology. When Charles Barry, and there's a huge number of record drawings, over 10,000 from Barry and Pugin, but the technology that we're adopting now to deliver our major programs, and to be honest, probably our all the stock programs and projects that we'll do in the UK going forward, is all driven by technology, and how we will deploy this technology to help us deliver our projects, and how we will use this technology in the future to operate our buildings is something that's really driving the future brief for the Palace. And then the environment. So this is hopefully something we'd never have to see, but environmental changes on our buildings have a huge impact. This is obviously shown a very extreme end of that, but thinking about climate change, thinking about what might happen in the local area, whether it's, you know, moving to greener transport mechanisms, how people might change their way into work, and really thinking about, you know, the long-term climate impacts on our buildings, and to make sure that the buildings remain useful as we start to go into these more extreme weather conditions. So when we started, we, and this is highly simplified, but I'm sure it will attune to many people, we sort of said to Parliament, sort of, who are you? You know, tell us about yourselves. And we got two things back, really. We got the org chart that said, look, these are all the people that work here. And we got the process. So in terms of Parliament, the process that they adopt is legislative. And there's the Erskine May, which is a great read should you be really interested in the procedural nature of how you pass legislation. And if you care to, you can probably buy a copy of it from Amazon for about £400. I haven't yet bought my copy, but maybe one day I will. But that didn't really tell us how they use the building. That told us who was in there and the process that they go through to operate the building, but didn't really tell us about the different interactions and how the building would be used. So we started to plot out, we started to understand, you know, okay, we know procedurally how a committee works, but who are the people that attend? Where do they sit? What's the difference between a general committee and a select committee, not from a legislative perspective, but from how it's used, the different people that attend, what's the sort of broadcasting requirement? And we started to really lay out in the brief how the building is really used. And then started to think, well, committee rooms effectively are just meeting spaces. Where else do people meet on the estate? How often do you meet? What data do you have? What's the room booking information that we can take? So lots of data gathering and pulling it all together in what we call the initial project brief. So a fully detailed explanation of who uses the building and when. And then there's the sort of oddities about ceremonial events that happen at the Palace of Westminster. Again, great information about what these ceremonial events do, why they're there, why they're important to the country, but nothing that actually really explained how they happened, you know, who needed to support them, what's the interaction between the two houses, who's doing what and who's going where. So lots of good information captured there. And then starting to think, so the Palace of Westminster is only one building on the parliamentary estate. To the right of the drawing there on the north, you can see the Northern Estate, which is effectively Portcullis House and other buildings serving members of the House of Commons, and a selection of buildings to the Southern Estate, which are predominantly for the House of Lords. And then started to think, well, how do deliveries work around the estate, and starting to plot those out. And you just start to weave in this complex web of information. And it took us the best part, I would say, of about 2 years to catalogue this all, get it all in good order so that we could use it going forward. And we sort of ended up with this diagram, which I know you won't be able to read. But on the left-hand side, you've got everything that supports the chamber for the Lords. On the right-hand side, everything for the Commons. And the activities in between are those that support both houses. Because the two houses do operate independently, and we needed to really understand what that meant, and then start to categorise, well, who really has to be in the Palace of Westminster versus who could be on the Northern Estate or the Southern Estate. This was how we ordered things, so structuring the brief. As I say, there wasn't a manual to say exactly how Parliament operated, so we did two things. We set out technical area requirements, so all the things that you might need to do to fix the building to make it sustainable, energy efficient going forward. And then all the things which is around capturing the business area. So some of those things that you should thought about, how committees operate, how the public engages. And really where we are at the moment is going through a process of seeing how feasible it is to deliver all of the requirements, whether it's a technical requirement about, you know, conservation, or whether it's a business area requirement about delivering the requirements of the two houses. And then we start to think, okay, so how can we adopt that? So this is a very old drawing of the original palace, but it's quite a useful one to explain the point. So from an M&E perspective, the original palace really had one steam boiler and steam-driven fans, which were used to ventilate the entire palace. That's quite a small footprint. You know, as we move forward, we start to fill it up with a lot more plant for, you know, highly intensive use committee rooms and chambers, starting to think about protecting the building, starting to think about those different environmental controls for people, the building and the heritage collections, the artworks, the statues, the frescoes painted on walls. So all of this drives up the volume of space required. And then start to think about accessibility. You know, the palace was built and there was not a single lift in there. The lifts that exist within the palace at the moment are really built within cantilever staircases, so really short, really small lift carts which aren't accessible or Part M compliant. So then we start to think about how could you get new lifts throughout the building to make it far better in terms of step-free access. And then you start to think about visitors. You know, this building was never really built for the general public to visit it. That's not what we want for our public buildings going forward. So starting to think about how we can safely get people in and out of the building to visit committees or the chambers or the education centre or all those other outreach programmes that Parliament are seeking to deliver. And then once you've done that, we start to overlay all the requirements from all the other business areas. And quite quickly, we found that the building simply wasn't big enough any longer to meet all those requirements. And really where we are today is back at those original set of requirements, and particularly looking around the areas that we've highlighted here, because really there's three currencies that we deal with at Parliament. There's the cost, as in the capital cost to deliver it. There's the time that it will take to deliver the programme. And the other real currency we're working with is space. So the available space, and many of the things on the left-hand side are a trade-off for other business functions. And we're currently going through that process of navigating through those three areas: space, time, and cost, to make sure that the future Palace of Westminster is fit for those, for another 150 years use, is integrated with technology, but most importantly serves the legislative needs of Parliament and the two houses. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Andy. That is fascinating, I have to say. Just to remind everyone, if you do have any questions, please just put them into the chat box and we'll cover them at the end once everybody's had a chance to share their presentations. We're going to move on now to Hannah Wooler, who's the director at Matter of Place Architects. She has a specialism in sustainable reinterpretation of heritage buildings, and she's going to be talking to us about PAS 2038 and some specific case studies. So we're going to be moving away from one particular case study and looking at potentially several. So Hannah.
Actually, because it's only 10 minutes, I could only get one in, so I'm afraid it's another one, but it's more generalised. So this presentation looks at how to define the brief using PAS 2038, mainly from an architectural perspective. Could you just let me know, can you see the slide? Fantastic. Okay, so this is me. My name's Hannah Wooler. I'm based in Norwich, and I'm an AABC qualified architect. It means I'm qualified to work in conservation. And I've recently set up Matter of Place, so I'm 2 weeks in. And the practice is designed as a sort of specialist vehicle for working with the heritage-based placemaking. So my particular interest is long-term holistic sustainability of the built environment, and that's particularly looking at traditionally constructed buildings. So under PAS 2038, they have a very convenient determinant for a traditionally constructed building, which is just anything prior to 1919. So that sounds pretty obvious, but if you look at this, you'll see there's a common theme of Norwich in my pictures. I like particularly to send out nice images of Norwich around the world. So here's a quayside in Norwich, and looking at how we consider these buildings, so you would see there's a lot of domestic properties along the front. However, under the way that we look at upgrading buildings, actually this building, and this building, the cathedral, have more in common than these three. So the three, this building, the blue building and the cathedral, are all traditionally constructed. They're all prior to 1919. They have different levels of protection, which we'll come to later, but they're a very different beast than the other three here, which were all built as infill properties in the early 2000s. So this is the example project that I'd like to look at, and this is one where we use PAS 2038 to define the brief. This is Music House. It's the oldest residential property in Norwich. There's evidence of it in occupation in the late 11th century, but we don't actually know that that's when it was built, so it may even be older than that. The oldest bit is just to the left, just off the screen here. So it's currently a complex of 5 buildings on King Street, which is the road, the southern route coming into Norwich. Here's a medieval map. It's a Norfolk County Council asset. It's run as an adult education facility, but previously it was a brewery. This whole stretch along here opening onto the river were breweries, and so it makes this site quite complex. This building is actually owned by Norwich City Council and leased by the County Council, but together the 5 buildings are denoted in the conservation area, and this building, the Music House within the complex, is Grade 1 listed. So here we can see this is King Street going along the top here. This is the river going along the bottom. This is Music House, which is the Grade 1 listed building, and the other 4 are locally listed and denoted within the conservation area. So I've actually worked on this project for a number of years at Hudson Architects, which was where I was managing director until a couple of weeks ago. So we were first appointed to do a complete site adaptation. So they were looking at densifying the use of the site to make it a site of specialist craft education with input from the Craft Council and to align with other things that are happening in Norwich. It was a brilliant brief and included water source heat pumps and a district heating circuit based in the basement unit beneath the craft block. So we had a large amount of centralised plant, which was then distributed throughout the site. The current distribution is from a site over here, which is very congested and undersized for the whole. It's a very large old gas boilers underneath the maltings. So the new strategy was to have water source heat pumps with photovoltaics on the south slopes. It was quite controversial. I don't know if we would have got the photovoltaics due to the sensitivity of the site, but we were definitely going to try. Unfortunately, that was very expensive, as you can imagine. So Norfolk County Council asked us to go again, looking at doing it on a building by building basis. So we looked at the stage 1 proposals for the tons, looking at a localised servicing for the tons, then the craft and the stables as one unit, still using the water source, but sized only for those 2 buildings. And then looking at the maltings with a reservicing based around the current plant location. However, we did that during COVID, and the business cases that had used the justification for the resurfacing of some of the buildings fell apart because the tons was to be a conference centre, which obviously, as soon as we were working remotely, no longer stacked up. So we were then asked to approach the whole site again with a low carbon agenda. So reviewing the building using PAS 2038 to see if we could establish a brief for the decarbonisation of the site. So at this stage, I just have to say I'm not an expert in PAS 2038, so I can try and answer your questions, but I'm qualified to work within the framework. So PAS 2038 is the latest of a suite of documents which came out of the Each Home Counts review. So this was an independent review based on some retrofit pilots which began in 2014. Each Home Counts, I think, was completed in 2017 and quickly followed by this framework, which led to PAS 2035, which was a detailed framework and process for how to retrofit dwellings. It's quite well established, and some of you may well know it. PAS 2038 is the more recent. It was issued in 2021 for non-domestic buildings. Now, non-domestic buildings, here we are broken down. So this is a really nice document with a really nice diagram within PAS 2038 showing the breakdown of non-domestic buildings within our the UK building stock. And of the UK building stock, 35% are deemed to be traditional, which is the pre-1919, and it's those specifically that I'm looking at here because it's that there's a very different workflow for the traditional buildings, which obviously Wensum Lodge falls within. So these are the clauses within PAS 2038, and in this project we were asked to go up to 6 or 7, which is the brief development area. So if you're looking at brief development, you're looking at these initial clauses of the PAS, and I'm going to have a little bit of a look at 4, 5 and 6. So these are the workflows. So all buildings that are being assessed through the PAS 2038 come in at the inception at the top, and then we go into the assessment phase, and the assessment is first of all you have to get your team together, which is inception stage 4, and I'll talk about that a little later. And then we go into the assessment phase, and at the assessment phase you need to establish, or the lead professional, and it's very interesting in PAS 2038 because the lead professional has to be qualified in non-domestic energy assessment. So it's very usually a building services engineer or somebody with that specialism who will be the lead professional going through this process. So I would be a specific professional contributing to the report, but it's unlikely that an architect would be the lead professional. So you've got your team together. Then you need to assess the building in clause 5, and so the assessment is where we first off establish, as we looked at in that photo before, whether we're looking at traditional or non-traditional construction. We then, if it is traditional, we come across to this flow through where we have to look very carefully at the significance and impact of the work that we're proposing to the building. Once we've done that, we come back into the main flow through. As I said, I'm not a specialist. If you are really interested in PAS 2038, NOCN the BSI and Retrofit Academy have really good presentations and training that they can do you on this workflow. But under clause 5, so this assessment, this is where I come in, because every building that's subject to retrofit compliance within the PAS shall be assessed by a person or persons suitably qualified as specified in 4.2 or 4.3, and hereafter referred to as the assessor. Now, I am qualified as the assessor in this, and to be qualified, there's a list in 4.2. It's a list of professionals. If the building is deemed to be traditional, you also need an additional qualification, and there's a list of courses that you can go on to work to see whether you are then capable to assess a traditional building. And if it's traditional and protected, therefore listed, you also need to be AABC, which means at the moment there are only 2 or 3 of us qualified under. I think at the point that I was qualified, there were only 2 of us qualified in the whole country. I'm sure people are catching up behind. So under that assessment, there are 4 areas of assessment. So context, existing fabric condition, occupancy and energy performance. So within the scope of the context, we'd be looking at the architectural, cultural and historic context, the physical setting of the building, including its aspect and exposure as determined by this exposure map, and any planning constraints. You then need to look at the existing fabric condition. So you're looking at structural condition, what it's made, how it's made, the construction, the building services, how they're functioning, how they're controlled, and the presence of any defects, and very specifically whether they're defects that need to be dealt with ahead of the retrofit or whether they will be included within the retrofit that's being proposed. You need to look at the occupancy of the building, the patterns of use and the energy performance, and this is usually used on, ideally used on historic records, but if not available, it gives you some benchmarking and some assumptions that you can use. Special considerations are in the building performance. So one of the things that they don't like in PAS 2038 is assumptions. So they're really looking at you doing in situ U-value measurements on traditional buildings, because actually traditional buildings tend to function a lot better than the assumed values, which means the potential upgrade is less. And so it's very important you actually know how your building's performing in terms of thermal conductivity and then damp and cold bridging. To look at the existing servicing, both the strategy and the longevity of the systems that are there, the ambition for change, both within the client and within the framework of the project, and the building's capacity for adaptation. This is specifically looking at Wentham Lodge. So here you can see when we came to the area where we had to look within 5, and this is part of the assessment, is the building's significance. So if a building is traditionally constructed or protected, so it's either or, so you have to do an assessment of significance if the building is built before 1919, which means that all 5 of these buildings had to have a significance assessment. We actually had one commissioned under part of the work. They have to be commissioned under the BSEN 16883. As it is, we had a statement of significance prepared externally, so we understood, and because I've been working on it for a while, we understood how significant the building was. But it turns out that the maltings was a lot more significant than we thought, because actually it's the only remaining maltings building within Norwich which speaks of its large brewing history. So even though it's not listed, it is deemed to be more significant than a standard any of the other buildings on the site, apart from the music house. So then you move from clause 5 to clause 6 to the evaluation of the improvement options. And in this, you start with a list of all the potential improvement options, and then you take them down to those technically applicable and appropriate for the building. And then those are assessed against the significance. In this instance, in terms of servicing, we were looking at whether that should be electric and what that meant and what it meant with a new substation, and in any case. And then were we looking at air source heat pump on a building by building basis, or were we looking at water source, and in which case how much? As it turned out, the water source is very applicable and appropriate for that location due to some previous studies that had already been done on the river in that location. When we're looking at evaluating improvement options, the building fabric, this is a really useful tool. It's the Sustainable Traditional Building Alliance guidance wheel, and it shows you the interconnectivity of the matters that you're considering. So if you're looking at different ways of generating heat, it then indicates which thermal elements of the building you need to consider. It generates a really useful report, and it's something that you could use, or you could direct your clients to look at to get an understanding of how holistically they're going to have to think if they're looking at upgrading various elements. Here's some this is the sort of description from the STBA. And then because you're looking at traditional buildings, you then have to do a heritage impact assessment to make sure that the package of work that you are proposing is relevant and appropriate and doesn't affect the significance of the building. So here's an example of the one that we carried out here at Wensum Lodge. It's probably a bit small to read, but here we have on the first page the significance, the specific areas of significance against evidential, historic, aesthetic and communal, which is how in general heritage impact assessments are assessed. And then this is the first of the many clauses of pieces of proposed work, looking at what the implications would be, what fabric was affected and what the proposed solutions were. So here are just some photos of the site, so you get an idea of this wonderful building and the varied areas. So here we are, this is looking at the roof. This is, I think, potentially even a 10th or 11th century roof within Music House itself. These are the brewery buildings. This is Jernitz Bar, which is underneath Music House, including a column which is exactly the same as some of those within the cathedral. So I think there is some consideration that it might have fallen off a boat on the way to the delivery, to being erected within the cathedral to end up in this property. And then you can see the current condition of some of the buildings here. And this is why we were looking at potential complete upgrade. And here are the references which I've used, because there are a number of other people's reports within this available for anybody who would like to have a look.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Hannah. I think it's really interesting, actually. My personal view is, well, from my personal experience, what I realized is that we don't have the skill or the time to look at every single historic building that needs to be retrofit individually. So I think something like PAS 2038 that kind of goes half the way there and provides us with some structure might be a way of actually demonstrating and delivering that change at scale. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to call upon our last speaker now, and that's Mark Butt. Mark is Head of Estates Capital Programme for the University of Winchester, and he's responsible for the long-term estate strategy and major projects. He's going to provide us with a broader estate view of developing retrofit strategies at the university, and he's going to be looking at adaptive use of buildings, the avoidance of waste in the built environment.
Thank you. Let's just share my screen. Okay, can you see that okay, Ahmed? Excellent. So this is going to be a very different presentation than the previous ones, sort of less technical, more strategic. Let's just move on. So just a bit about me first. I started out as a chartered building surveyor and then got interested in project management. I've got a lot of experience client side, consultant side. Done in the past 10 years, I've done 2 masters, one in sustainable building design, and the other was an MBA in research and adaptation of adaptive reuse of buildings. And it just so happens that I've been involved on projects. These pictures show some projects, so where they're kind of either historic or historic buildings or nearly historic buildings, which is quite an interesting topic about how you actually classify what a historic building is, I think, and that's something that's definitely of interest these days. So my day job is on the, as Ahmed said, I'm a head of the Estates Capital Programme. It's a relatively small programme at the moment because of capital constraints, but effectively I look from 3 years beyond. And I'm responsible for the sustainability brief, external appointment of external consultants, contractors, and pretty much everything in that field. So this presentation is going to be kind of twofold, really. One, a little bit about my kind of research interest, if you like, which came out of the MBA, which was about adaptive reuse of buildings, and that brings some quite interesting strategic view of benefits and challenges to do with buildings. And the second part of it, I'm going to throw in a case study here at the university, where we've been looking at a site that we ended up evaluating existing buildings of a historic-ish nature. So that's quite interesting. This picture, incidentally, is an interesting project. It just goes to show what you're capable of with adapting buildings. If you've not seen it, it's a grain silo type of building, which was then converted at huge expense, no doubt, into something at the V&A waterfront. But so moving on, so reusing buildings and adaptive reuse of buildings, what are the benefits? I'll just roll through some of these, and they're fairly obvious, but it makes the point that there are some key things. Embodied carbon is one thing. That's the very easy tick in the box, if you like. Yeah, we're going to reuse the building. We don't need to build a new one and waste all that carbon. There's a huge amount of waste in the construction industry, not just in the construction process, but actually demolition as well. And this is where I started to dig into reusing of buildings and the importance. Biodiversity and planetary limits are key issues. I mean, we are talking about, when we talk about waste and building new construction, we are actually using finite resources that are available on the planet. And that's now starting to impact on, obviously, if you, even if you make batteries, lithium batteries, you're affecting biodiversity and the culture of that area. So the other aspect of this is the bottom left-hand side of the slide, culture and heritage and traditional skills. So it's really important, I think, to keep the fabric of older buildings there for many, many reasons. Not just our heritage culture, but also the psychological impact of people just navigating their way around the world and how they feel. And also the upkeep of traditional skills in terms of how we look after buildings. We need to really focus on keeping those skills alive because they're very important. In fact, as we move from into a very challenging world of energy use, some of those traditional skills will be really heavily required. Sufficiency, my last point on this the benefits slide, really is all about, or actually, we in the global north, we have, in the Industrial Revolution, we've created a huge amount of the built environment. We've used a lot of the Earth's resources to the expense of those in the global south and the less developed countries. So there's an imbalance, if you like, and also there's an argument to say that, we have enough with our existing buildings. Let's just reuse them and just avoid building new where we can. So what are the challenges with the process? And I think a lot of these, again, we know from the previous speakers in terms of the challenge. Where I'm coming from is quite interesting because I think from a client perspective, all this uncertainty and complexity of dealing with historic or older buildings builds in cost and risk, essentially. So the first thing that happens is I end up trying to evaluate and look at these buildings and get teams on board to do the work. Inevitably, the quantities fail. Just say, well, we don't know how it's going to work out. We've got to attach a risk to it and a cost. So it becomes really difficult to try and compare a reuse project with a new project because new is seen as a lot easier, less risky. And when you come to talking to board of governors or trustees or any client bodies, they don't like risk at all in any respect. So it pushes you away from these reuse solutions. Technology, Andy talked about technology, which is a very important point. I think still a growth area, needs to be really expanded upon and used in terms of cloud point modelling and building surveys. It's starting to become regularly used, but it really is a big thing. And lastly, capitalism and growth. I mean, I ended up looking into the area of degrowth actually, and this goes back to that sufficiency topic of actually, the whole construction industry is based on this theory of growth and capitalism, and it's very, very hard for us to shake that off and do something which is brave and new and something we need to do. Regulation, I'll just touch on that. I mean, I think we obviously have conservation areas and listed buildings, but the other areas, the non sort of identified historic assets, which I think is where we need to focus, and even 20th century buildings, I think, start to come into the fore here, because in 50 years' time there'll be historic buildings, so we need to not forget them. I'll pass over this. This was just an illustration of part of my research on the circular economy, to make the point that actually, when you start to look at how the industry applies circular economy theory, there are lots of different ways of cutting it, and I didn't find many ways where they mentioned the reuse of existing buildings. It was all about, well, actually, let's knock these buildings down and reuse the products. But actually, that doesn't work from an energy perspective. You're not really gaining much. Let's briefly move on to the case study, because I know we're running a little bit short of time. So here at the university, the buildings in orange are owned by the university here at Winchester, and the ones in grey are is the hospital, which is next door and within. The hospital is shrinking to a degree, and then the university is expanding. So there's a natural sort of symbiotic relationship going on here. The site I'm going to talk about is one circled in red, which we purchased from the hospital a couple of years ago. This is the site. So it's effectively the old outpatients department. So the main, you see on the right-hand side, the big building called the Butterfield Wing. That's a listed building, which is part of the main hospital. They came out of this site, which is the old outpatient site. They came out of it some years ago, and as you can see, it's a delightful jumble of buildings, some of which are more interesting than others. We bought this site with the view to flattening it and redeveloping it effectively. And you can see there's a variety of buildings. So the oldest part of the building is only as young as 1927, and then it just spans through all the ages, and it's quite a challenge. Where this sits in terms of conservation in historic buildings is a little bit explained by this diagram. So the conservation area is the line in blue, which basically borders two sides of our site. And we are pinned in by listed buildings. So we've got this building here at the hospital, which is listed. There's a little bit of listing there, and there's another building down here. So we've got this kind of pincer movement going on, which, from my experience, it tends to mean that the planning department will effectively look at your site and say, well, actually, you are effectively a historic asset. There's no two ways about it. So that is some challenge for us as to how we put our proposals forward. So we did a lot of work. We talk about analysis. We did a lot of work with this building to try and work out how we could reuse it. To start with, we were going to redevelop the whole site, and then I put that forward, and it was unpalatably expensive, shall we say. Then the question got put to me, well, can we reuse any of these buildings? And I thought, great, yeah, fantastic. It's coming my way. So we did a lot of work, and we had the existing team at this point. We did a lot of work to try and decide whether we could reuse some of these buildings. So these slides just explain a little bit about that background. So the benefits of reusing, I think, when we go back to that original chart, if you like, with reusing these buildings, we can demonstrate embodied carbon by doing some life cycle carbon analysis. That's fairly straightforward. We can demonstrate reducing waste. That's fairly easy to do. Biodiversity doesn't really come into this site because it's not really biodiverse to start with. We can improve it certainly with a new building. And culture and heritage and traditional skills definitely supported by keeping these buildings. But do we need a new building when we can have the existing one? No, we don't. The issue here really is that we found it very difficult to make it work as an existing building, because some of those buildings, as you can see, were not really fit for any purpose whatsoever. So there'll be a process of weeding them out required. So this brings me on to the challenges that we had with that site. So really, I mean, we started out with a team that were looking at the redevelopment. We didn't really have the right resources in place to look at a reuse. So one of the issues we had was that we didn't have the right skills on board, and we had to try and buy them in. And that actually started to impact on program time as well. And also, as I mentioned before, it started to add a bit of risk and cost, which started to make the reuse of the buildings look less attractive than a straight new build. So that was quite a challenge. And I think that's the kind of the final message really that I want to bring, is that I think when you have a strategic approach, I think you've got to have some sector leading sustainability knowledge to start with at the outset, if you're really going to be serious about looking at reuse of historic buildings. You need some very good planning and risk management if you want to try and make the business case stack up. And I'm very careful identification of what is historic and what isn't, and how that comes in. In terms of the brief, I think this is something that we haven't delved into here, but is quite important, is actually trying to build in some flexible requirements and looser environmental strategy. So, you know, you can adapt into these buildings with use rather than try and knock them into shape for what you want to do. And that's really important in terms of reuse. Feasibility wise, as I say, all about risk and cost management. If you don't have the surveys up front done by the right people, and you don't have the right team in place with the right knowledge, some of these unknowns will feed their way into risk, and then that feeds their way into cost, and then these things just won't happen. So it's really about getting the right team on board and good planning. And that's it really.
Thank you very much, Mark. We have just over 10 minutes for questions, but what I'd like to do is just start off with maybe a broad question to everybody that spoke today, and it's about how you factored in or how you thought about climate change adaptation within your retrofits, because we understand that retrofit has a strong path dependency. So if we focus on some things instead of others, then we might in 20 years time be inviting some problems, potentially overheating as an example. So I was wondering how you each thought about climate change adaptation and where we're going in terms of our environment.
Well, within the brief for Wensum Lodge, it was fundamental, because that was so the first 2 times we cut the project, it was looking at the usability of the space. Because they were existing buildings, there was limited opportunity for changes beyond the fabric changes to the in this instance we could re-roof all the buildings, so it gave us great opportunity to insulate. So a lot of it was done in the servicing and the design of the windows. However, by the 3rd time we did it, it was entirely focused on decarbonisation, and so in that we had to look at future fluctuation events, overheating, and also the river, because we were in very close proximity to the river. So a lot of the work on that site was looking at flooding, because it's a site at risk of flooding as it is, and it does flood, not from the river, interestingly, but from all the water coursing down the hill from the streets overground, trying to get into the river. So that was one of the main focuses of the work that we did. And the first 2 dealt with the flooding, and then the 3rd dealt with the complete decarbonisation.
Yeah, I mean, I think climate change adaptation, I think, is now a sort of default on the brief for most building design, isn't it? Really, and I think it's in my mind, historical reused buildings are more adaptable by definition, because they've been there, and I think and they've been proven to work in many respects. Whereas a new building, my experience of building a new building is that you never quite get what you expect, and they're overly complicated. So I think adaptation is
I
good.
really like working with traditional buildings, because you can't be forced below a certain level. That's the thing, like with new buildings, as the budgets get constrained, there are more and more impacts on the building fabric. Whereas if you already have a building, you can't make it smaller or the walls lesser. You know, there are fundamental minimums that you can't go below, which is really, it's really helpful in terms of making a building perform better.
Thank you very much. We've had lots of activity in the chat, and people have kind of asked questions, and others have answered for us, I think, which is good. So there's a question here for Hannah, though. Hannah, could you talk through some of the fabric assessments you undertook for the project that you shared, and how they maybe changed what interventions you undertook for the retrofit?
Yeah. So in answer to the question about the U values, so we tried to get somebody to do U value assessments of the building. So we went out and sought tenders for people to return to do U value assessments. And it turns out there's hardly anyone out there doing it. So really hardly anyone. So in the end, we did get one company come back, and they said 3 per wall was what would make that's a compliant U value measurement. However, in this instance, some of the walls, we know, some of them are massive, so 3 seems very undersized, and some of them, particularly in the music house, they change, the build-up changes on like a square metre basis, because it's such a palimpsest of extensions and accretions and everything over the years. So actually what happened in the end was Norfolk County Council bought a U value measurement, and we did as many as we could before summer came, because we didn't get the U value kit until April. We did a couple of tests in our office to make sure that we could calibrate it and work it, and then we just moved it around the building until we had that really hot week in May, and then there wasn't enough differentiation between the internal and external temperatures anymore. So Norfolk are going to start doing them again now. So not enough is the answer to that question. We know we needed to do more, but even from the findings that we got, the building was performing a large amount better than it said by the assumed U values. And we had also not taken assumed U values just from a table. We had done a build up of all of the fabric, because we'd done some actual intrusive investigations and we knew what the build up was of each of the walls. We'd done a sort of fabric assessment of the U values of each of the walls, and then even then the in situ U values all came back as performing much better. And we didn't, some of the areas of the building were damp, and we didn't end up getting that far, because we know that damp walls don't perform well. So we focused on the walls were working well, because the damp would be sorted as part of the work.
Right, thank you for that. There's a question that Andrew answered in the chat, but I'm just going to repeat it just for those that are going to be watching the recording, and that's about the House of Parliament project, if they were looking at water source heat pump technology as part of that, a part of the refurbishment works.
Yeah, so, and I mean, the answer is yes. Like, I mean, sure, a couple of things. We're really limited in terms of technology that we can put on the building. So stuff that can go underground, or even taking river source from the River Thames, is something that we're really keen to investigate, and we are actively investigating. It's something that we, you know, ideally we'd go to a fully electrified building, and that's certainly the strategy. They're recognising that, as with everyone, trying to get temperatures that meet, you know, old cast iron radiators and are able to operate in the thermal conditions that we ask them to is always a tricky ask, but we are trying to pursue certainly low temperature and low carbon technologies.
Great, thank you. And I think Mark is going to be leaving us shortly, but just before you go, Mark, if you could just final word on the potential, because you've been looking at obviously an estate-wide approach, has there been greater potential for trying to integrate some things like low carbon technologies for energy generation?
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, we've just done a £3 million funded public sector decarbonisation scheme, which is effectively going and adding air source heat pumps and some PV and some BMS controls actually. But you know, I'm a bit of a cynic. You know, I mean, I think you should be looking at the fundamentals of the building first, and not kind of bolting on renewables next. But you know, I'm paddling against I fell against a stream of water, saying like, technology is fighting against me. And so, yeah, it's the answer, but it's not the first answer.
Great, thanks for that, Mark. Yep.
Yeah, on that, as part of the traditional buildings upgrade, there's I can't remember the exact percentages, but it's something like a well-maintained building, so well-maintained sash windows and well-maintained traditional building can perform 20% better than it is. So a lot of it is just in the making sure your windows are draft free, making sure you don't have damp, because any damp is a thermal breach of your building. So there's huge amounts just in the sort of maintenance and upgrade of a traditional building before you get to even thermal upgrade, before you get to technology.
Absolutely. Right, thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Cheers.
Just a question about U values again, Hannah. Sorry, I'm not sure if you touched on this earlier, but it's a question about how many in situ U value tests are deemed to give a sufficient representation, because it varies across different thermal elements.
It does vary hugely, and I think that it has. As I said, we looked into it, and I don't think there's a definitive answer, but I think everybody who's working in that field says you can, there is never too many, so as many as you can do within the remit of your project. And if you know the building well as I like, because we've been working at Western Lodge for so long, you have an idea of where buildings are changing. But even then, even with intrusive testing, there's no accounting for pockets and rubble infill and all of the things that happen in traditional buildings. So I would be interested to know, but as I said, this company quoted and they said 3 per wall, but it was undefined how big the wall was, and I would say that isn't enough. And I think all evidence coming through is saying that, yeah, as many as you can.
Right. And the second part of that was, does PAS actually suggest a minimum with respect to how many measurements you're taking?
No, it doesn't suggest a minimum. It just says as appropriate. So it's just all in the skill of the and the budget. And that's the thing, is that doing all of these intrusive tests and investigations early they add cost early on in the process. And I think, as we all know, as retrofit becomes more and more standard, and even in new design of new low energy buildings, allowing more and more for the upfront design and investigation is how we need to go.
Thank you very much.
And if I could just sort of, I mean, sure. And we're, as everyone's sort of tackling the same sort of problems, but long term, we would be hopeful to publish the results of the test that we're doing at the Palace of Westminster, because, I think part of this is about community sharing information, so that, maybe we can't answer it today, but hopefully in 3 years' time, we could answer what would be a representative sample. Obviously, the Palace is, one wall is 300 metres long, so getting representative of that built over 30 plus years is difficult, but hopefully we can use this as a bit of community to learn those lessons and share.
Absolutely, and I think that's a good place to bring this session to a close. We hope that you've all found it really useful. Thank you so much to